the second law. Deuteronomos, as all our Greek scholars would know, the second law. So that's the second law, which we think was a book discovered by King Josiah, and it is a beautiful book, a great book. It's almost like the book of love, like the book of the Gospel of St. John, for us, is the book of Deuteronomy for the Jewish people. And we know there that there's a great sense of social justice happening. So very much influenced by the prophets too, and they talk a lot about God's name and reverencing God's name. So the book of Deuteronomy is another source, and a final source is P. P is for priests. Once the kingdom of Judea was destroyed, the temple was gone, the land was gone, and the Jewish people were in exile, they had nothing left except the priests. And they began to gather in what we call now synagogues to worship God. And so the priestly source started to emphasize, well, the Sabbath. The Sabbath as the day of rest, and the day when we gather to worship God. And the priestly source started to emphasize how separate we are as the Jewish people, faithful to God, from the pagans out there. So we've got to be holy, and so on. So they're the four sources. And we've got a little handout for you. No, we haven't. We've got a little on the screen just to put that in some sort of perspective for you, because it's not easy to comprehend. And now, final thing to say is, it wasn't actually four written documents. We used to think it was perhaps like that, but we know now that it wasn't four separate documents that got gradually mixed together over time, but it was four traditions, perhaps with the use of the words and so on, but as they were mixed, they actually changed too. Not just changing in mixing together, but changing in when they were written or when they were put together. So that, for example, most of them took their final form after the exile or in the exile and then when they were coming back. So that the perspective then is, my goodness me, we're in chaos, we're in exile. We are a people who have been displaced. So where does God fit into all this? Well, God is the one who's against the powers of this earth. If we believe in God, He'll rescue us. That's what they had to believe when they were in the exile. And so that profound faith that even though we are so poor now, even though we're in exile, even though we've got nothing of what we used to have, king, temple, land, we've got God. And God's the ultimate one we're faithful to. And it's that perspective in which they rewrote all of that, you see. So it tells us, in a sense, just as much about the exile as it does about time past when, for example, they were in Egypt and they were suffering there. Or even, we would say these days, back to the beginning of the world when everything was in chaos and God brought order. God brought order into chaos in creation. God saved us from the Pharaoh, the wicked Pharaoh in Egypt, and God now saves us, will save us when we're in exile. So that's the second thing, a little bit on the Pentateuch. And finally, conscious that time is running out, of course, dear people of God, we're going to look a little bit at the Exodus. And the first thing I'd like to look at briefly is, why is this book, the second book of the Pentateuch, so important? Well, here's a little bit of, I think, why it's so important. It gives us the key concepts for us to understand what our relationship with God's all about. And the first concept I'd love to say is, it gives us the concept of deliverance and salvation. That's where the whole idea. So if you say, are you saved? Will Jesus save you? You're using a word that goes right back to the book of Exodus. So we've got to understand how that word was first used before we'll ever understand what it might mean for us in our situation. That's something I love thinking about. What on earth would salvation mean for postmodern human beings? It's got to be relevant to them. And so that's a great word that comes to us from the book of Exodus. A second word that comes to us from the book of Exodus is the word covenant. Covenant basically speaks about the relationship between us and God. Us and God. And there is a relationship which we call the covenant. And we do something and God does something. And that's what we say happens every time we go to Mass, actually. We renew the covenant between us and God. A third concept, if you like, one that's not so strong, but it should be, is God's presence. God is present with us. God is present with us. God is always present with us. That comes clearly to us from the book of Exodus. God's not remote. God is with us. And obviously that's so important for our understanding of who or what God is. And of course, just two other little things. Always seems to be, in our relationship with God, a sense of faith. I've got to believe, if I need God in some way, that God will act. And the other correlative of that is that God is the one who acts now. God will act. God does act. God's always the one who causes things to happen. God is the one who is acting always. And that comes to us again from the book of Exodus. So what's the book of Exodus about? Well, there are three parts to the book of Exodus. The first part, the first 15 chapters, is the story of the Exodus from Egypt. Profound. The second part is a small little part of the wilderness stories, of when they're in the wilderness for the 40 years. It's chapters 16 to 18. And the final part is at the foot of Mount Sinai, when Moses gets the 10 Commandments. Have you ever thought of what the 10 Commandments really are, and are they still relevant for us and all that sort of stuff? Well, we've got to go back to the book of Exodus, chapters 19 to 40. Just should say that too, in the first part, okay, there is the leaving from Egypt, which is extraordinary. But there are two things within it, within the whole story, which are critical. One is the extraordinary relationship between Moses and Pharaoh. The plagues are immensely significant because what's happening in the story of the 10 plagues is that God, through Moses, is overturning the power, the might, the authority of the Pharaoh, the greatest ruler on earth. That's mightily significant. And the second thing is when they get to the Red Sea and they can't cross, their hearts are, it says, full of fear. And then they cried to the Lord. And the Lord heard them and acted for them. And that's faith. That's faith. So that's the first. They're two of the key things. Then the wilderness sojourn. Well, I think anybody who's really interested in the spiritual life and going on desert days, we say,